Welcome back to the 94 podcast. My name is Kosi. Welcome back to a brand new video. Arsenal beat Manchester City by a goal to nil. Gabriel Martinelli on target. We're going to be diving into the tactical masterclass of Mikel Arteta and how he finally got the code right. He absolutely cracked the code against Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. And maybe Man City will talk about an absence of Rodri, the absence of Kevin De Bruyne as well, and how Erling Haaland was actually detained and contained by that Arsenal defense, who I thought were very, very good. But also, with Mikel Arteta, you've got to talk about the substitutions. Tomiyasu, Kai Havertz, and Gabriel Martinelli. They changed the game, and that is where they won the game, by the way. That is where Mikel Arteta eventually got the better of Manchester City, because when he introduces Kai Havertz and Tomiyasu, you don't expect them to be as efficient as the players that were on the pitch before, and they were absolutely very, very good. Thomas Partey as well, I thought, had a very key part to play in the game and in the goal as well. So we're going to be diving into the tactical analysis and the brilliance of Mikel Arteta over Pep Guardiola. Hit the like button, subscribe to the podcast as well. Where does this leave Arsenal? Because in my opinion, Arsenal could be title challengers even when the code is not yet that good, even when the tactics are not yet clicking. They could be title contenders already. So what we saw in this game was obviously Arsenal going with some kind of unknown formation. Mikel Arteta going with a team that no one expected. Edin Nketiah starting up top, of course, and Jorginho in midfield. I thought Jorginho was kind of an odd one, and Edin Nketiah, even when he started in this game, I don't think he was as efficient. I don't think he was a really good start. But of course, Mikel Arteta wanted that kind of energy, that kind of pressing, players that can actually work themselves off. And I thought Eddie, that is what he brings to this side. It's the same thing with Odegaard, it's the same thing with Jesus and players like Declan Rice. They work very hard, they press, they don't get tired, and they relentlessly keep on doing the right things, right? So Edin Nketiah and Jorginho were the two players I didn't expect to see in this team. With Pep Guardiola, I was actually very, very surprised, and you will be very, very surprised as well, because we thought Jeremy Doku or Jack Grealish could start this game, especially in the wide areas, but he actually decided to go narrow. And in the end, what we saw was Arsenal and Man City cancelling themselves equally, because the game was very, very narrow. You didn't have Jeremy Doku, and you also didn't have Jack Grealish. So the wide areas for Man City were literally stale. Benjamin White and the likes of Alexander Zinchenko really didn't have a lot to do. Phil Foden tucked inside, Zinchenko tucked inside. It meant that Manchester City couldn't create opportunities and score goals out wide. With Arsenal, they started with Gabriel Jesus, who really doesn't have the capability to replace Saka, and that meant that Manchester City didn't have a lot of worry in behind. So you don't see Gabriel Jesus run in behind. You don't see him trying to create problems for Nathan Ake, especially on the left hand side, as well as Josko Gvardiol. And also on the right hand side, or on the left hand side actually, you don't see Trossard in the first half trying to get in behind Kyle Walker. So in the end, what we saw, it was more of a game that was affected in this area. This was the most important part of the game, the middle of the park, right? So you had Lewis there from Manchester City. You had Bernardo Silva was playing as the 6 as well. Then you had Phil Foden, who was playing out wide, but then drifting inside as well. So most of the players and most of the play for Manchester City was actually deep in midfield. With Arsenal, what Mikel Arteta did, and he was very, very genius of this, because he understood the role of Rodri. He understood why Man City have been losing games without Rodri. He's kind of the metronome of this team. That is where they spread their passes. He's the head in midfield. He sprays passes all over the pitch. And because it was more like a deficit, he understood that Man City will try to get the better of Arsenal by trying to put two players instead of one, who is Rodri, who is not available. And we saw that. Lewis in midfield, and then again we saw Bernardo Silva in midfield. And in possession, I've got to say, Man City really looked very, very comfortable in the first half, because there are two players who are very good on the ball. They're not very good out of possession. I'll talk about that in the second half. But in possession, Manchester City were actually very, very good. So we saw Bernardo Silva, let's say number 8 is Bernardo Silva around here. And then we saw Lewis as well in this pivot. Because they didn't have Rodri, they had to go two players in midfield. And that allowed Arsenal to literally go Jorginho, Odegaard, Declan Rice, and Alexander Zinchenko as well, attacking into the midfield. So it meant that Manchester City could have the ball a lot of the time, but they couldn't do anything. Why? Arsenal had more numbers in midfield, and Mikel Arteta, that was the first genius take from him. Can you overload Manchester City? Can you overload the midfields that Manchester City don't have any kind of joy? He actually did that. And the second part of how, again, Mikel Arteta was brilliant in this game, he did not allow these two, Nathan Ake and Kyle Walker, to get a lot of joy in the wide areas. Of course, it was a little bit narrow, so you had Phil Foden attacking inside like this, and then you also had all the Manchester City players attacking inside. So the wide areas then were left open for Nathan Ake to travel, or just Kokivadio, but it was Nathan Ake much of the time, and then Kyle Walker to travel as well. But what Arsenal did, and this is very, very, very interesting, Leandro Trossard stayed a little bit out wide, and Gabriel Jesus as well stayed a little bit out wide as well. So what that actually did, it created a 90-minute problem for Nathan Ake, and also Leandro Trossard created a 45-minute problem for Kyle Walker. So Kyle Walker couldn't come in this part of the game to affect the game, and Nathan Ake also couldn't come up front to affect the game. Literally, you had two players cancelled for Arsenal and also for Manchester City. But then that also meant that Arsenal, when they were in possession, they could use Gabriel Jesus. They could also use Leandro Trossard. Why? Because they were literally in the final third. They were literally in the Manchester City half a lot of the time. So kind of boring in terms of statistics, in terms of tactics, kind of cancelling each other out. You saw Declan Rice drop a lot of the time in these areas to help out Alexander Zinchenko, which I thought was a genius move. And then Zinchenko drifting into midfield to cancel himself with Phil Foden. Phil Foden didn't try to go wide because he knows the danger of Alexander Zinchenko. He knows the capability of Alexander Zinchenko, that when you drift out wide, when you actually try to utilize the width of the pitch, Zinchenko will hurt you in the middle of the park. So in the end, Foden is narrow, Zinchenko is narrow, and both of them cancelled out each other as well. Another player that I thought had a very interesting role in this game for Arsenal was Declan Rice. Rolls Royce of a midfielder, absolute Rolls Royce of a midfielder, because we saw two things from Rice. One, he dropped in these areas here a lot of the time to help out with Alexander Zinchenko, but then again you saw him pressing from these areas, right? He's one of the players that played, that kind of free role. He started off advanced, but look at where Kovacic fouls him from. He's deep in his own half, trying to pick up the ball and progress it. And then at the end of the day, when Manchester City were in possession, especially in their own half, you saw Declan Rice to try to press from the front as well as much as he could. And that actually allowed Arsenal to, cover a lot of ground, and it allowed Arsenal to have that one player that can actually have the legs and have the willingness to run to cover much better ground. But what actually beat Man City for me, and why I thought Manchester City eventually kind of felt like they were not going to win this game, was Pep Guardiola's desire to keep a clean sheet and eventually win the game later on. So you look at these substitutions, you look at what he did in the second half. Pep, he brings on Jeremy Doku. Why he brings on Jeremy Doku? He's now established that he can keep a clean sheet. He's now established that he's gone through the dangerous phase of Arsenal and, that spell of, possession. So he thinks, can we now go and find one goal? Can we go and win it? So when he brings on Jeremy Doku, the game absolutely changes, and Mikel Arteta, genius, absolute genius from Mikel Arteta. Because when Jeremy Doku comes onto the pitch, it means one or two things. One, it means that Arsenal can now therefore discongest the midfield because the game has gone to wide areas. And what does he do? He brings on Tomiyasu, who is better defensively, to take on Jeremy Doku. And then he also does something very interesting. He brings on Kai Havertz, and that is where Mikel Arteta wins the game. But before we get into that, actually, let's talk about Gabriel Martinelli and the role this boy plays in this game. Because when he takes off Trossard, who was really ineffective in this game, apart from, helping out with, Kyle Walker, then he brings on Gabriel Martinelli. It changes the game. It absolutely changes the game. Because what Martinelli has, and, Trossard doesn't have, and Jesus doesn't have, and Saka doesn't have, and no one has an Arsenal, is this ability to track behind and come back in drop deep, and then run with the ball in this space, run at defenders, and create all sorts of space for himself and problems. And what we saw, again, you look at the goal. Kyle Walker is concerned about Gabriel Martinelli, but then Diaz is concerned about Kai Havertz. So what that actually does is it puts Nathan Ake in a very, very dangerous situation. Does he go and join up Kyle Walker to stop Gabriel Martinelli, or does he actually stay in position and deal with all the runners that are actually coming? And what that actually does is it creates a 1v1, a dangerous 1v1 with Gabriel Martinelli and Kyle Walker. You don't beat Kyle Walker in 1v1s a lot of the time, but for 90 minutes, for 45 minutes, there is a guarantee that Gabriel Martinelli will beat you in a 1v1 at least once or twice. And it happened, he beat him. right? He gets to the ball, anticipates where the ball is gonna fall, and Kyle Walker doesn't have that intelligence at the moment. But again, Martinelli comes onto the pitch in the second half. Arsenal can now utilize the wide areas. They can utilize the left-hand side. The game can stretch from being narrow to a little bit wider. And what actually that did, it pushed a couple of Manchester City players from the midfield to go to wide areas, and Arsenal dominated the midfield in the second half. Kind of genius from Mikel Arteta there. Kind of genius, because he brought on a player that Pep is worried about. I mean, he's talked about Martinelli all the time. He's a cheat code. He's a genius player. So he's worried about him, and Man City are worried about Martinelli. And the moment Martinelli comes onto the pitch, there is one more player that shifts across to help out with defending Gabriel Martinelli, and also Kyle Walker as well. So the midfield is taken over. Even before Thomas Partey comes onto the pitch, Arsenal looked a little bit heavier than Manchester City in the second half in midfield. So let's talk about the substitutions, and let's talk about the goal, and let's talk about how Manchester City eventually were outdone. So Martinelli comes on, obviously. Jorginho goes off. Thomas Partey comes on as well. I thought Partey really had a very huge part to play in this game. So in the goal, he comes on. Eddie stays on, but Alexander Zinchenko goes off. Tomiyasu comes on as well, and then Kai Havertz as well comes on, right? I think Kai Havertz comes on for, is it Jesus? I think it's Jesus who comes on. And Kai Havertz then becomes your, kind of nine. So, literally, part of that midfield, right? And then Eddie stays up top. What this does is, Tomiyasu is very different from Zinchenko. Zinchenko tucks into the midfield, but he doesn't have the physicality, and he doesn't have that aerial ability that Mikel Arteta required Tomiyasu to have. And eventually, if Tomiyasu doesn't make that run, and if he doesn't head the ball down for Kai Havertz, the goal doesn't happen. But we're going to talk about that. And then you have Kai with his height and his hold-up play, which is actually very good. And then you have Eddie Nketiah as well, and Thomas Partey. So the game was literally cancelled, right? You have Manchester City players, sprayed all over, trying to stop this Arsenal passing, kind of genius in midfield. And then you had around 4 Manchester City players in their own half, trying to make sure that they don't concede, trying to keep that clean sheet. So Thomas Partey then, with his ball playing ability, he plays this ball. Let's just get the marker, which is actually better. He plays this ball into Tomiyasu, right? And it's a deliberate ball. So when he plays this ball here, Tomiyasu has already made this run past Phil Foden, because here you have Tomiyasu in 3. And then you have Kai Havertz making this run. And I thought Kai Havertz actually could have hit it first time, and maybe it could have fallen anywhere, right? But again, he plays it safe. So Tomiyasu heads it down for Kai. And what this actually does is it takes 2 players out of the game. It takes Diaz, who is now concerned with Tomiyasu, and it takes Kyle Walker, who is now concerned with Gabriel Martinelli. And because now the ball has gone in the opposite direction, Kai is there. I think it was Givardio who is there, right? And then Nathan Ake is in the penalty area. These 2 players, Diaz and Kyle Walker, are now concerned with Kai Havertz. So they turn. When they turn, Gabriel Martinelli down here on the picture can now make that run. Of course, Tomiyasu makes his run in the penalty area. Martinelli can now close into the space and arrives in this dangerous area. Kai just lays it off for Gabriel Martinelli, who takes a shot, it's deflected, and then it's a goal. Genius stuff from Mikel Arteta. Very genius stuff from Mikel Arteta. That is why he has those different profiles. Kai Havertz, hold up play. I think if it's Eddie Nketiah, he hits that first time. But Kai, because he's got that ability to hold the ball up, he actually doesn't hit it first time. He literally just holds it, lays it off for Martinelli, and Martinelli can have a clean, strong shot. And that is how Arsenal eventually beat Manchester City.